والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum for everyone who's joining. Today we are honored to have Dr. Rania Awaad to be joining us for a special webinar intended for parents after the tragic events that have happened in Christchurch, New Zealand. I was 13 years old when September 11th happened. And in the days following, I remember the news coverage. There were Muslim men with Muslim beards and Islamic intentions. And as a 13-year-old middle schooler, all I wanted to do was to fit in, and being Muslim didn't help. It was a really tough experience for me. I remember at one point I told my mom to pick me up 15 minutes after my baseball games were finished because I didn't want anyone to see my mom. I didn't want anyone to know that I was a Muslim. I wanted to fit in. At that time, what I wished for so bad was for somebody to kind of understand what I was going through. That perhaps I could speak with my parents and talk to them, and that they could hopefully empathize with my experience and help me feel safe and like I belonged. So on Thursday night, when I learned about the events in Christchurch, my feelings went back to my 13-year-old self, thinking about the Muslim boys and girls that are in middle school and high school and elementary school today, and perhaps some of the challenges that they may be going through. But alhamdulillah, 2019 is very different than 2001 because we do have, mashallah, organizations, we do have leaders, and we do have capabilities within our Muslim community such that we can respond. And at this point, I don't think we are so reactive. Alhamdulillah, we are trying to become more proactive. And so it's with that I tee up this discussion about Christchurch, because our hope is that over the next 60 minutes, we'll have the chance to listen to our esteemed guest, Dr. Rania Awaad, talk a little bit about how do we go about actually having this conversation with our children in an age-appropriate way. After that, I'll be speaking for about 20 minutes in which we'll be talking about belonging and why that matters and strategies that we can facilitate that. After that, we'll be doing some Q&A. And the Q&A is going to be happening over the live chat. The live chat is available if you're viewing this via desktop computer, inshallah. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rania, who will be leading the first portion of our webinar. But before we do, I want to make sure that I give her a appropriate introduction. So I met Dr. Rania for the first time when I was in Berkeley. She invited our educational director, Sana, and I to a event at Stanford University. Dr. Rania actually is a clinical instructor at Stanford in their Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. She's a practicing psychiatrist based at the University of, or at Stanford University. And there she's also director of something called the Stanford Muslims and Mental Health Lab. So this is a specific organization within Stanford that does a host of research on the Muslim community to gain expertise and kind of subject matter knowledge on a lot of these topics. Dr. Rania is not limited to that role at Stanford. She actually plays a very important role in the Muslim community broadly, but especially in San Francisco. She's the clinical director of the Khalil Center in San Francisco. For those that don't know the Khalil Center, it is an organization that focuses on psychological and spiritual wellness among Muslims. I have personally had the opportunity to interface with their organization in San Francisco, in Chicago, and now also in Toronto. So, mashallah, Dr. Rania leads the effort in San Francisco. Outside of that title, doctor, Dr. Rania has another title, and that is Ustada. Mashallah, at the age of 14, she actually traveled to Damascus, Syria to begin her religious pursuit of knowledge. And so, mashallah, we are very blessed to have someone like Dr. Rania, not only in our community, but here with us today. And so I'll be handing it over to Dr. Rania as she talks about the first portion of our webinar around how do we talk to kids around this topic.
Thank you, Amin. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam ajma'een. Thank you so much to Noor Kids for this invitation. I want to just say just something real quick here about Noor Kids is that they are very much part of our family, and I hope they're part of all of yours. And if they aren't yet, I hope they will become. Because this work on the identity, Muslim identity of our youth is so incredibly important. And I'm so proud of Amin and Sana for the work they've done. Alhamdulillah. Also, this event is co-sponsored by the Khalil Center, and I hope, inshallah, all of you get to benefit from the Khalil Center. Like Brother Amin said, it has local offices in San Francisco, in LA, in Chicago, Toronto, and New York. But we also have quite a number of online services as well for those who need assistance. They're able to access us through our online services, workshops, classes that we can offer really at any place in the country. And inshallah, I'll speak about that a little bit more. I want to begin our discussion today really as a call that came to ask how should we talk to our children about this very difficult tragedy that happened in New Zealand, and should we in the first place? Now, mashallah, I feel like I have to really begin by offering my condolences to those who were directly affected, mashallah, the victims and their loved ones, and also the community there, and really the international community as well, the ummah, that has really been feeling this pain. And, I thought about, you talked, Brother Amin, about 9/11, and I thought about how why is it that in the American Muslim scene, this particular incident hit home and really felt very much like it's really affecting us maybe much deeply than perhaps other news that we hear, because certainly there are mass shootings and murders and bombs and all kinds of things that happen, natural disasters. But this one really had a different kind of response within many of us, hence the outpour of asking, how do we talk to our children about this? Wallahu alam, my personal take on this is it really reminded me of, some years back when Chapel Hill happened, the shootings of the 3 young Muslim college students and graduates. And to me, I felt this was similar, but on an international scene. And probably because we felt that it could have been us, those 3 could have been our children or ourselves, because they were targeted just because they were Muslim. And the folks in New Zealand, they're a Muslim minority and a Muslim non-Muslim majority country, and their masjid looks like it's our masjids, right? And it looks, so much of their life as Muslims in a Western land looks like ours too, and hence our children as well. So it really, when that happens and there's a trigger that sort of happens and makes you fearful, and then you start to panic and wonder, could we be next? Of course, it's a very real question, and the question that follows is, how do we talk to our children about this? Well, for me, I, like you, inshallah, draw my inspiration directly from our Sunnah and from the Quran and from the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And I want to share with you, one of the most beautiful hadith for me personally in the line of work I do related to mental health and the deen. There are so many hadith, narrations about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that fit so beautifully into this exact topic. And it's a very, very short hadith that I want to start off the discussion with and tell you that the Prophet ﷺ was really remarkable in how he knew how to communicate with children, how to pick up on their emotions, and was really emotionally intelligent in being able to cue in on what is happening and then give appropriate responses, of course being the perfect of creation, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There's a young Sahabi that most people don't tend to know. His name was Abu Umair. But many people know his brother, Anas ibn Malik. And the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as you know, was very close to the family of Anas ibn Malik. And so Abu Umair was the little brother who lived in the household. And whenever the Prophet would visit, he would see him very often. But on one particular day, he entered to visit the family and saw that Abu Umair was very upset. He was grief-stricken. Something was wrong with him. And he noticed it right away. Now, here we start to learn the prophetic example of how you communicate with children in times of distress. The first thing he did is actually recognize that something had happened. Being cued into children is really important, and the sunnah of our Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The second thing he did is he didn't go and approach him directly. He actually talked to the people around in the household and said, "What's wrong with Abu Umair?" And they told him. The third thing he did, he then approached him and very gently, and this is how we know the story because it's narrated in the hadith, he said to him, and listen to the wording, "Ya Abu Umair, ma fa'ala an-Nughayr." So we know the boy's name is Abu Umair, and we see that he rhymed the word Nughayr to his words. It's beautiful, so eloquent. And we learn that the word Nughayr means small bird. And so basically the translation is, "Oh Abu Umair, what did the bird do?" Look at the wording. He didn't ask him, "What did you do to the bird?" He asked him, "What did the bird do?" As in to say, it's not your fault that the bird died. His pet bird had died, and that's why he was so sad. Nor did the Prophet ﷺ sort of just ignore or dismiss his emotions, nor did he say, "I have all of the ummah to take care of and big, important, heavy things to deal with. I don't have time for the children." Nor did he say to him, "Oh, you'll get another pet soon." He was cued into his emotions. And I think for us, that's a really important lesson, prophetic lesson and wisdom of how it is that we talk to children, especially when they're distressed. And in this case, we are too distressed. So, now that I've shared with you a little bit of where the inspiration for this is, I want to merge these two things along with really our understanding of the deen and also our understanding from mental health perspective of what is age appropriate, how exactly do you speak to children of different age groups, because certainly the way we speak to a 5-year-old is not the same way we speak to a 15-year-old, right? But first and foremost, it's important to know that your children, our children, if they are starting, and I'm sure since Friday till today, if they haven't been discussed or haven't been given direct knowledge of this, they have at least heard, snippets of information, chatterings here and there. They know, especially the first time that you received the news, I know it's the same in our household, there's a sense of like shock and just a sense of like, oh no. And children are so intelligent that they pick up on these things. They know when something's not right. And then they do what children do. They start asking questions. So what's not useful is having the really hushed conversations. And if you put that together with no reassurance, that's when things start to grow and grow in their heads in terms of fear and distress. So let's figure out together what to do. I want to share with everybody 7 steps. 7 steps. And in these 7 steps, hopefully, it helps quell their anxieties and ours as well. So the first I want to share with you is, hold on, I hope sound is still coming through. Sorry guys. I want to share with you that
sounds still good. You're good.
Thank you. I mean, that, it starts with us, right? When people start asking, I'm so sorry you guys. I'm not sure what. This happens.
Mashallah, Dr. Rania is a very important person. So no, I'm kidding. I'm totally kidding. But thank you. Yeah.
It happens every so often. Phones and pages will go off, as you know, in a medical office. Forgive me. All right, back to what we're saying about the 7 steps. So number 1, it really starts with us, as in to say, parents are always asking, how do we, talk to our families? And please know that it has to start with us, as in to say, it doesn't actually start with speaking to our children. In fact, in the 7 steps, you're going to see that it takes a while to even start to engage them, because really it's where are we in processing the news. Now, for many of us, if you're like myself and received the news on Thursday night, it was really hard to tear away from the news feed, just the updates, because it started off with, 9 people, then 15, then 20, then 30, then the number eventually reached to 50, now 51 people. And so many, every time something like this happens, a tragedy happens, we're glued to our news feeds, to social media, to the news. And our children see that eventually, right? If they missed it on Thursday night, they probably saw it through Friday. and they see kind of the anxieties as well. So really for us to start to unplug from social media, especially if we're not able to deal very well with containing our emotions as much as possible. And it's okay, because it was difficult and tragic news. And sometimes it's not always possible to talk to our children immediately either. And that too is okay. And that's what I want to share first and foremost. So the unplugging from social media, the centering ourselves, the processing the news with people that we trust, maybe they're friends, maybe it's a therapist, maybe it's somebody that we can actually walk through our own emotions before engaging with our children. And, it's okay too that they see us frustrated, or they see us sad, or they see us even angry, but it should be contained anger or contained frustration. As in to say, it's really impossible to not have emotion, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us all with emotions, them and us. But it needs to be contained, because you know what children are doing, young and old alike. So even teenagers, they're looking to us as the adults in the room to cue them in and how they should react to the tragedy, right? So how we're doing with our emotions and how we're expressing them is giving them a direct script in what they should do, essentially. And it's okay to take that time we need to go process, go to a room, go talk to a friend, go do something to process a little bit before talking to them, as long as we get back to reassuring them. It's the issue here is with the reassurance. If they don't have that piece, that's where fears and anxieties really start to take over. That's number one, starting with ourselves. Number two is preparing. Preparing here means that we take some time to figure out when we are going to engage with them, should we decide to, and I'm going to break down the age groups in the next point so we know whether we should engage. But let's say for those we will be engaging with, the children that we will be engaging with and telling them this news or talking to them about it, preparing ahead of time and figuring out what is the message you're trying to convey. Because if it's a very flustered message and it's a message of like anger and down with those people, then it may not be as constructive as you hoped it would be. So think about the values you're trying to convey. Think about the message you're trying to convey. Think through all of that first. And sometimes it also means, especially with the older children, educating yourself from all the different angles. Because it may be, on Monday we had a talk just for the teens from ages 12 to 19. And it was so interesting to see their questions on the topic, things that maybe you and I may not have specifically asked. One of them asked, was it okay for the one senator to be egged on the head? That's what was going through their mind. That's what they were curious about. So, is that kind of retaliation okay? Should we have cheered him on or not? So it may be so different than what they may come back with something so different than what you were thinking about, masjid safety at the youth program. Whereas for them, they're thinking about something totally different. And so part of even being on the same page with them and figuring out what they need is actually preparing ahead of time all the different angles as possible, as much as possible, right? So the other thing I want to say is, in our Islamic tradition, even from the worst of circumstances, good things can emerge. This is part of our deen. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, as we all know here, inna ma'al usri yusra. Right? So with difficulty will come ease. And it doesn't say after difficulty, it says with difficulty. And I want to say that to you because it's very important to remember the key messages and values, because in the moments of difficulty, it's so hard to relate them. So to prepare. The other thing, number 3 here, is to inquire. Inquire means to ask, essentially, what's happening. But let's break this down by age groups. The first age group is the youngest, the toddlers. And you may have children of various ages, so really listening to this part about what age groups would be very important. So the first age group is the 3 to 6. So basically toddlers, we're talking about like a preschool, kindergarten, first grade kind of ages. So for this age group, really the most important thing to remember is if they have not been exposed to horrific news of any sort, you should not expose them. Just let them be in their blissful world. Right? The bliss of childhood, so to say, that bubble that they're in. They don't need to be exposed to this. Parents ask questions like, shouldn't we talk about how we were attacked and how this was awful and those people came after us. Not in this age group. That makes more sense for an older age group, which we'll get to in a minute. But this 3 to 6 age group, if they are unaware of it, just leave them in their little bubble, essentially. And if you suspect that they have been exposed, so maybe they went off to school, or maybe an older cousin or friend had said something to them, or it showed up in conversation, like they're talking to their friends or siblings, or in their play. Children do a lot of things in play that cue you in what they know and don't know, or what they're scared of. And so if with their dolls or with their toys, they start to do shooting sounds or things like that. So you are like, what's this? Maybe this is not normal. It cues you in that this is definitely a time to talk with them in more detail. So, I want to kind of share that with you and let you know that this age group, if they have heard and they are upset, then it's time to talk to them. The next age group is 7 to 12. And for 7 to 12, the answer to the question of should we bring this up, the answer to that is wait and see if they ask you. Wait and see. For some, and every child is different, and as parents, if you have multiple children, you'll know this. They're even your own children have different personalities, right? From another. So for each child, it's a different thing. Some are so oblivious or in their own little world, they don't need to be taken out of that bubble when horrific news happens. Not in this age group. But if they do know, or if they're a little more cued in, or if they have older siblings and friends, or if they're in the older age group, that 10, 11, 12, then we should actually be discussing with them. And in the next point, I'll say how to discuss it. But this is the question of should we discuss it? So for them, there may be other things that are nonverbal that cue you into the fact that they know. Things like regression, that they start to kind of go backwards, right? Behaviorally, that they're doing things, being more clingy, more being scary, not sleeping so well. And those things may cue you in that they actually know, and you do actually really need to speak with them. And they're signs, take them as signs to invite you to talk to them. And for teens, which is the next age group, tweens into teens, in this particular age group, we should just assume that they know. Why? Because they're so exposed. So many of them have direct access to, their social media, and to phones, and to laptops, and to all kinds of, and to friends in general. So the likelihood that someone is going to tell them something is very high. So you should assume that they already know, but don't assume that they have all the details. Because if we know anything in this age group, we know that they sort of like live off of memes, or just very short clips that they may kind of, as long as the 1 minute it takes to like post something on Instagram, right? That's probably what they're following. And so it may be just like, just patches of information. That's not the full story. And so it's really important at that point that where they need us is to help them fill in the blanks in what actually was correct and what was flawed in the information they received. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit more of the how, but this is the should. Now, for children that have developmental delays or disabilities, and the parents of children that have developmental delays, they know them best. You know your child best. And the advice here is to essentially speak to them at their developmental age, not at their physical age, and to be as direct and straightforward as possible if and only if you have a suspicion that they have been exposed to this news. If they have not, it's not worth opening up that discussion, right? So be as in the most clear and appropriate manner as possible. For this, the should, I want to say to you, it's really important that we do things as age appropriate as possible, because it really does change from child to child and from age group to age group. And that takes us directly into number 4. So if you remember now, we spoke about the inquiry, which is number 3, and number 4 is listen. To listen. This is something we as parents don't do as well. We tend to actually do a lot more troubleshooting and problem solving and trying to get to the bottom of things. But it's really important to understand where the children are coming from. What is their point of view? What is it that they are worried about? The reason is because otherwise we as adults may project our adult level fears onto the children. They may not be worried about the exact same things you are. You may be looking at every door in the masjid wondering, could somebody come through here? And that's what's going through your mind, and those are your fears and anxieties, when their fears very well may be, is this something related to like their friends and are worried that they might be bullied if somebody brings this up at school the next day, right? So that's much more important, to know where they're coming from and address that, because it's not worth bringing in all your fears and anxieties and increasing that for them, right? Also, this idea of listening is really important, because we tend to listen. It's not just listening with ears. We also show that we're listening by putting down other things like our phones and like our laptops, and any other distractions, because kids know when they're being listened to and when they're not, when it's only like half-hearted. So as much as you're following that thing and you really want to know, when it's time to engage with them, all of those distractors really need to be put away, in order to get the best effect. And also know about children in terms of this listening. It may be that we as adults can process this, even horrible news like this, in a day or two or three, depending on how we're doing personally. But children may actually need a longer period of time. So you may think the conversation is over and everything went okay and they went their own ways. And then 3 days later, they show up again and ask you the same thing. And then again, 5 days later. And it may just keep happening, where they come and keep getting reassurance. Please know that that is normal and also expected. So it may take them more time to process what happened here. Number 5 in the whole story is to validate. Now it's interesting, because we got through all the way to number 5 out of 7, and we haven't really talked too much, have we? And that's really important, because we're meant to inquire, we're meant to listen, we're meant to validate before we start to really do too much talking. And that's not really the way many people interact with children. But these are well-tested ways that are known to be very effective. And in times of tragedy and grief like this, validating is really important. And basically what that means is that when, you might ask, and you might start with a very simple question, like, what things are you concerned about? Or what's upsetting you about what just happened here? And once the child responds, whatever it is they say, even if it seems kind of fantastical, or if it's very different than what you were thinking, validate it. Validate it as in to say, even if it doesn't make sense to you what exactly their reaction was to the news, you could say something like, it sounds like you're feeling, fill in the blank of the emotion. Maybe the emotion is, shocked, or maybe it's upset. Maybe they're upset, but you're angry, and you have two completely different emotions. So don't project yours onto them, but rather say, it sounds like you're feeling really upset, right? I can understand that. There's no judgment, and this goes back to the prophetic sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, where when he asked Aba Umayd, ma fa'ala an-Nughayr, he asked it in a way that made it clear that he wasn't blaming him. He made it very clear that he was asking. He actually very beautifully put the blame on the bird, so to say, right? So that it was clear that there was no judgment of what happened here. This is really a prophetic sunnah, to validate and not to judge as much as possible. And to try our best. This is not very easy, or maybe not even very intuitive, but this is what truly works with children, and actually even with adults, mashallah. Sometimes children have a really hard time expressing their emotions. Maybe they're not able to say angry, frustrated, disgusted, scared. So one of our jobs as parents, as adults, is to actually help them fill in the blanks, is to actually help them put labels to the emotions they're feeling. So maybe they're struggling, hedging, not really sure. And so you might say, maybe you mean frustrated, right? And so you kind of help them with whatever that labeling that emotion. And it really helps them bring themselves back to a very balanced state of being. Number 6 out of 7 is simplifying and correcting. What do I mean by simplifying? For children, young children especially, they can have very abstract ideas, can be very hard for them to understand. So something that happened all the way in a country that they had never heard of, maybe they've never heard of New Zealand, and they're not really sure, and it sounds very scary, and maybe and they're very worried it means that New Zealand was like, the street next door to them. Like they have no idea the context or the distance or what exactly is happening here. So remember, children have a very rich imagination, and that could really, as beautiful as that is, that can also, when it's a scary thing, can keep them up at night, can make it very difficult for them to process what this all means. So what we do instead is really try to simplify the concept, especially for young children, as much as possible. So when they try to say something about guns and shooting and what happened, and they've been exposed, so now you have to speak to them. So now saying something very much like, a very confused and a very angry man took a gun and shot people. The police are making sure that everyone's safe and this isn't going to happen again. Done. Why do I say that? Because the over explaining, the too many details, the extra stuff is really not useful, not helpful, not useful. So for them, try really hard in this young age group to simplify very complex subjects. And as all of you are parents of young children know, particularly young ones, sometimes they kind of drop really heavy questions on you and they start to ask you, and you're like, oh, wow, here comes the big question. And you start to begin to explain and you're like halfway through your sentence and they're like, okay, and they just sort of run off, I'm sure many of you have had that experience. And so for children, sometimes they don't need the whole picture, nor do they need all the complicated situations. They just want to get a sense of what it is and get reassurance of what's happening. Now, for the older children, the tweens and to teens, now here is where we need to go a little deeper and really start to explore where they're at, what they understand, what they don't understand. And parents are always really upset because they say, they got all this, their friends at school told them X, Y, Z, I'm really upset, or they read such and such online, and it's not accurate. Especially in this age of Islamophobia, where there's just all kinds of really negative stuff said about Islam and Muslims. So, the most important thing with this age group is to not, in this point, right when a tragedy happens and you're trying to talk to them and have a real heart-to-heart with them, is not to question their sources. Because what happens then is that just, you end up arguing over the sources and you don't get to the real issue. What do I mean? Your kid comes home and says their friend in high school, or some kid in high school in the class said, and the Muslims that, and the white supremacists this, and this happened, and that happened. And it's kind of a backward story, or maybe it's a narration that's not as, the way you see it or how you'd like to see it. So instead of arguing with your child about, well, that kid doesn't know what he's talking about, and that's no good, now you're arguing about the sources. So instead, just take the sources at face value and go, okay, so that's what you heard. Now, let's talk this through. Maybe it's an article they read and the article is skewed in its point of view. So now we need to teach them something that's very important that is going to last not just this, but really lifelong, which essentially is thinking critically. And to ask very critical questions like, so what does that mean? And if it's an article, maybe you ask questions like, okay, so that's information that was there. What's missing? What do they not put in the article that's important? So when teens start to really think about what's there and what's not there and why it's there and how it's written, why it's written, then they're able to take that skill and use it really forevermore. That every time something comes up, they're able to kind of on their own start asking these questions and just don't take things just at face value or because their friend said so. So therefore it must be true, So we teach them to ask questions about what they saw and heard, and it really helps them beyond that kind of very clickbait headline or meme. They start to question what it is they're actually listening to or hearing. Number 7 on the tip list here is to model hope and faith. It's really important that as parents, we do our very best to model as much hope in the future and strength in our identity as Muslims. Brother Amin's going to speak about this quite a bit in just a little bit here. But conveying our pride in being Muslim and our Islamic identity is really important. It really helps them see that we as parents are very strong in this despite what's happening around us. And it's really a great, as unfortunate it is, it's almost like an opportune time to really talk about the concepts that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in control of everything. That's a real take-home message that they can really start to understand here, that everything Allah has already predetermined and planned, and that He is the best of planners, right? And so they're like, really, this had to happen? And sometimes people get very angry and frustrated and even angry with God. And that too is a normal reaction, but it shouldn't be wrong that they have that question or reaction. Rather, it's what we do with the knowledge and the reaction that becomes very important, right? So we remind them, all the ayahs in the Quran that talk about Allah says He's going to test us. وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ, right? بِشَيْءٍ مِّنَ الْخَوْفِ وَالْجُوعِ وَنَقْصٍ مِّنَ الْأَمْوَالِ وَالْأَنفُسِ وَالثَّمَرَاتِ, right? Allah says He's going to test us with something of fear and loss of wealth and lives and livestock and fruit. And so, we remind them that Allah has said we're going to be tested and we're going to lose some people. We're going to lose some wealth. We're going to lose some things in our lifetime in terms of testing. And also to remind them, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will never test us with anything that our soul can't handle, a burden that we can't handle and bear, right? So these are concepts that are straight from our deen that need to be reminded in that moment. Other concepts too, to remind them, when the Prophet ﷺ said to Abbas, who was very young also at the time, and because he begins the hadith by saying, Ya ghulam, ghulam meant a young boy. And so he said to him, Ya ghulam, remember that if all the world gather to do some harm to you, they cannot except by the will of Allah. And if all the world gather to do good to you, they cannot except by the will of Allah, right? The pen has been lifted and the pages have tried. And so to remind them these really take-home concepts as much as possible, and to know that if you were to take these concepts and they're angry and frustrated or upset or fearful or whatever the emotions are, and you kind of help go through the processing of it, it turns out that if you help channel all those emotions into something that's much more useful and productive, it eventually converts itself into feeling like they can heal. So that hopelessness into meaningful contributions. And so many of our communities all around us, to be honest, our local masjid and an outpouring of emails and messages and flowers and baked goods and all kinds of things, subhanAllah, it's so interesting. And I reflect on, and Brother Amin, you said about 9/11, I reflect on how after, for those of us who are a bit older than you, around 9/11, and reflecting on the Muslim community in the state we were in then, we have come such a long way. And a lot of that has to do with our interfaith work, our reaching out, our sharing our Islam and Deen with others, talking about, essentially changing the narrative for ourselves, speaking about ourselves for ourselves. And it's still a work in progress. The Islamophobia industry is real. It's a machine that is real, and it continues to go on. But when we're able to take ourselves and our children and do things to channel that hopelessness into real meaningful contribution, it restores the soul. And it actually boosts the kind of resiliency they will need for the rest of their lives, right? So I really want to really harp on those 7 points. I hope they're useful in thinking about children and talking to children.
Mashallah, that was very useful. I think, Dr. Rania, it would be really also valuable if you could talk a little bit about the Khalil Center as well, in terms of some of the specific resources and services that people might be able to take advantage of in the Chicago, San Francisco, and Toronto Bay Area, as well as outside of those areas.
Sure, absolutely. The very first one that comes to mind, particularly I want to say related to our tweens and teens, especially those who are very well connected. And by that I mean to say, they have phones, they have laptops, they have, social media accounts. So, that particular generation, they tend to do a whole lot more of everything essentially is kind of like through online platforms. And an important thing I want to say is sometimes they may not turn to you. You may do all 7 steps and they may still not specifically come to you for help and aid. But our role as parents and as adults is to give them alternatives. And the alternatives very well may mean that that is in the form of, other adults that are supportive, so mentors, youth group leaders, teachers, but also it could be professional care. And so the Khalil Center offers, of course, direct services, as in to say direct therapy, professional therapy that's spiritually integrated. So it's Muslims who are professionals doing therapy, but the therapy also has Islamic components, kind of like what I was talking about here. I was kind of bringing the two worlds together, professional mental health along with the deen. But in addition to that, we also have crisis line and support line. So if you go to khalilcenter.com and it kind of opens up a chat box, there's someone there they can chat with who is on the other end, a professional, who they can actually, and anytime they're feeling a sense of crisis, maybe that's an alternative to talking to an adult. Maybe they're not ready to talk to you or someone they know. They want to talk to somebody else. We also have a crisis line, a phone line that they can actually call 1-8555-HELP-KC. All of that is on the website. I also want to say the Khalil Center offers workshops and classes. So we have these trainings on mental health first aid for Muslims that people who are interested in mental health can become certified on recognizing the red flags and the signs, particularly our imams and our spiritual leadership and community leadership. So that could happen in different cities around the country, wherever you may be located. Also the online therapy platform too, which means you can access the Khalil Center from really anywhere you are, inshallah ta'ala. We also have a blog on the website, so a lot of really great articles and resources, and you're welcome to follow the YouTube channel that has our lectures on it, and also just our social media accounts that also have really great information that's sent out periodically.
Mashallah, that's excellent, I can say firsthand, we've been able to visit the offices of the Khalil Center and have, mashallah, been so incredibly impressed by the amount of resources, level of professionalism, and just resource that exists for the Muslim community. And so I really want to make sure that families are able to the website is khalilcenter.com. That's KHALIL Center, CENTER, right? So for our friends in Canada, center.com. So, Dr. Rania, I'm looking at the time, and I also want to respect the people who are here as well. And I'd love to talk a little bit about this idea around belonging. I'm going to, I think, keep my comments a little bit short because I want to make sure that we have time for Q&A. Q&A, I think, is going to be a key value around what we'll be able to take out of this session. I want to start by talking about a piece of research that was done in 1951. Let me pull this up. Linda Brown was in the 3rd grade in Topeka, Kansas. And like all other 3rd graders, Linda likes playing hopscotch with friends and, is the apple of her parents' eyes. But her parents are worried about her because unlike her white peers, Linda isn't able to go to the same school as them. In fact, they are segregated. There's a school that is right next to their home, but Linda isn't able to go to that school. She is forced to go to a different school. And her parents worry that because of segregation, Linda may not have the same future or the same potential as her white peers. So her parents ended up bringing a lawsuit against the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas, and this became known as something called Brown versus Board of Education, which was a landmark event in the United States of America because it basically desegregated schools. But as a part of that lawsuit, Linda Brown and her family had to somehow demonstrate that because she was discriminated against, it would somehow impact her in a negative way. And so in the 1940s, 2 researchers at Columbia University, Kenneth and Mamie Clark, did something called the doll test, in which they worked with 5 to 9-year-old black boys and girls and presented them with 2 dolls, a black one and a white one. The researchers would then ask a battery of questions like which doll is beautiful, which doll is ugly, which doll is good, which doll is evil. And after this battery of questions, they'd ask the boy or girl which doll looks like them, which doll do they identify with. And they discovered something really troubling. 70% of the children ages 5 to 9 who they themselves were black would associate the negative characteristics with the black doll, saying that it was bad and evil and that they didn't want to play with it. And afterwards, they would pick up that same doll and say, this is a doll that looks like me. So the researchers discovered what's called internalized oppression, that is, in an environment steeped with discrimination, the issue wasn't just how the rest of the world looked at this community, but instead how these children began to look at themselves. Now, of course, for us, this is very interesting because while the environment for Muslims is, of course, different than the environment for the black community in the 1920s and 30s and 50s and even today, we do believe that there is a level of discrimination towards Muslims. And the question is, what impact might this have on our children? So our team at Noor Kids replicated this study in 2016, actually in the Bay Area. And in it, we worked with a group of about 50 children, half of whom went to full-time Islamic school. The other half went to full-time public school, but attended a weekend Islamic school. Now, those results were fascinating. However, what we quickly realized was that they were limiting because this was, in one specific geographical area. And we know that, having been to Atlanta or Dallas or Phoenix or the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, each of these communities are very different. And so over the last 2 years, we've gone on a journey to research this in a greater level. So alhamdulillah, as of now, we've conducted 400 in-depth interviews with 5 to 9-year-old Muslim boys and girls across 5 major cities, across Los Angeles, Phoenix, Dallas, Atlanta, and the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. About half of this group goes to full-time Islamic school. About half of this group goes to full-time public school but attends a weekend Islamic school. Now, the research that we did had 2 parts. One part was where we asked them questions or statements, and the children would respond by saying yes, no, maybe, or I'm not sure. So we'd ask them statements like, I'm an American, I'm a Muslim, Muslims are good people, Americans are good people, so on and so forth. And then we gave them a performance task in which we showed them 2 photos. And we asked them to ascribe characteristics to the photos, like which one has a lot of friends, which one is good at sports, which one feels like she belongs in her neighborhood. And then this was one of a couple of different performance tasks. But in the kind of spirit of moving a little bit quickly and just speaking to some of the high-level results from this research, I want to share some of them with you, especially as they relate to the events that happened in Christchurch. Before I do, just a couple of kind of disclaimers. Number one is this research is not published yet. Inshallah, our goal is to actually publish this in September. However, after the events in Christchurch, we thought it would be valuable to kind of pull some of this information together and share some of the high-level findings. The other thing to keep in mind is that, with any type of research like this, what we are sharing here is not necessarily a hard and fast rule. It's not saying that, hey, if we've found something, this is affecting every child or this is a, law. This is just what we observed in this one piece of research. And so I just share these disclaimers because they're important to keep in mind as we go through some of the findings. We discovered that 1 in 3 Muslim children responded that they do not want others to know that they are Muslim, and 15% of the Muslim children responded by saying that sometimes I pretend not to be Muslim. Now again, these are 5 to 9-year-olds. That's the group that we were investigating. Now this was articulated by Amina, who's age 5. She said, the kids in public school, don't know that I'm a Muslim, and I don't want them to know. Now what this is interesting is that it's communicating that at 5 years old, this child understands the difference that she has based off of her religion, and she understands that perhaps by sharing it with her peers there may be a consequence, and so because of that she's not sharing it. 1 in 2, 50% of the children communicated that they were conflicted about being both Muslim and American. Now, as we kind of look at this data and make sense of it, one of the first things that we think about is the age group, right? We are looking at 5 to 9-year-olds. We did not look at 15-year-olds or 13-year-olds, right? Remember, I told you I was 13, for example, when I started having like a quote-unquote identity crisis, right? Where I started kind of acting funny and doing funny things and like thinking about dyeing my hair blonde or whatever that might be, right? So oftentimes when we think about an identity crisis, that comes at a much later age, but we're looking at 5 to 9-year-olds. Why does that matter? Well, the reason why that matters and the reason why we looked at 5 to 9-year-olds is because there's a lot of interesting research that shows that by the time a child is 8 years old, a significant part of their self-concept or their understanding of who they are has been established. Now, this can, of course, change as time progresses, but one of the ways that we think about this is kind of like a tree. Once that tree has planted its roots, that tree may not change, a great deal. And so if a child at 5 to 9 is kind of communicating some of these conflicts, the concern is, well, then, when that child does go to middle school or high school, what does that mean in terms of their behavior and their attitudes? The second high-level thing that we think about, and especially as we think about the events in Christchurch, is related to belonging. When these children say, hey, I don't tell the kids at school that I'm Muslim and I don't want them to know that I'm a Muslim, are these children articulating that they belong? Now, one of the questions that's important to think about is, why does belonging matter? And, alhamdulillah, I often think about my dad just as an example because it's easy to talk about a specific kind of case study, and Allah bless my dad. But my dad from Karachi, Pakistan will say, belonging is a first world problem. Okay, if a kid doesn't feel like they belong, so what? Is that a big deal? Belonging is a big deal, and I want to share with you why that's a big deal. The first relates to what's called agency. So, for example, if I said that right now outside there was a, Tesla that has its lights on, if somebody owns a Tesla, they might reach for their pockets and say, oh, you know what, that's my car, maybe I'll go outside and take a look, right? Because a Tesla belongs to them, therefore they have ownership of it. If an individual feels like something belongs to them, they then have agency or ownership or care or concern over that item. And so if a child doesn't feel like their environment, their American environment, is one that belongs to them, one of the concerns is, will these children then have ownership or agency of their surroundings? Will they actually feel like this country is mine? This country belongs to me. The second reason why this matters is because of what we call assimilation or resistance, right? So, again, there's not a whole lot of research on the Muslim community specifically, but there is research on other communities, namely the Black community. And so, in a experience associated with this conflict, there were two extreme responses that were often manifested. One was assimilation, that is, trying to fit in. So this would be like, when I say, oh, maybe I'll bleach my hair blonde or go by Mo instead of Muhammad or something like that. The second would be that of resistance, that is kind of digging your heels into the ground to say, hey, you know what? If I don't belong, I'm going to make myself belong, or I'll, carve out my own area. And one of the ways that this is exhibited within the African American community is through, for example, the Black Panthers. And so anyways, as we think about this conflict related to belonging, we do think about resistance. I don't want to be alarmist here, and I don't want to be someone who is saying, hey, I'm concerned about resistance, and resistance can mean a whole host of different things. But I do want to share that as a parent and an adult, the way I think is different than someone who is in middle school. This is not just because of wisdom and how much knowledge I've acquired over time and the experiences I've had. This has a lot to do with the development of my brain. So in middle school, for example, some of the areas of our brain, the prefrontal cortex that allows us to kind of think into the future, is not completely developed. And so because of that, we can sometimes act on impulse and things like this. And so anyways, belonging matters to ensure that we don't have to, result in either assimilation or resistance. We can be integrated. And the third relates to self-esteem, right? We want to ensure that our children have a high level of self-esteem and do not look at themselves in a lesser way. One of the things that we know is something called stereotype threat. That is, if an individual feels like they're being stereotyped against, they often act differently. And so an example of that would be when I go and I am at the airport and I'm going through security. I know that I have nothing to be worried about, but when I give, my driver's license to the security person, he's reading my name and I'm sure he's looking at it in a Muslim way and he sees my beard, I start acting a little bit different. I'm like, hello, sir, how are you today? Oh, I hope today is a good day. Enjoy it, But I start acting differently, right? This is this idea of stereotype threat, that if we feel like we are being stereotyped against, we literally start acting in a different way. Now, one of the key things that people often ask about and people will share, especially when we think about this, is, do we actually want to be American? Or do we actually want to be Canadian? And by the way, this is exhibited in our information, or in the data set. We found that Arab children had less favorable attitudes towards America, Americans, and being American than any other ethnic group. And then we found this with statistical significance. Why was this? When we did the interview, it had to do with American foreign policy. So many of the children from countries like Yemen or Iraq or Palestine would say something like, Americans, sadly, they've done something in my country, or something to that effect. And so this idea of saying, hey, you know what, I don't want to associate with being American because, Americans have done bad things, or, Americans, for example, they drink alcohol, or Americans are, somehow, something negative. There's two key things to keep in mind with respect to this. The first is the idea of identity not being mutually exclusive, right? So it's not saying I can either be American or I can be Muslim, or I can be Pakistani, right? It's I can be both Muslim and an American, and a Pakistani, and an Urdu speaker, and an author, and a Minnesota Vikings fan, and so many other things, right? So it's not something that's mutually exclusive. The second is, when we say that we belong to a community, that means that this is a community that we feel ownership in. That doesn't mean that this is a community that we agree with wholeheartedly with everything that that community does. So if I feel like I belong as an American, that doesn't mean that I agree with everything that the president does, or everything that our foreign policy does, or everything that every American does. In the same way that if I feel like I belong as a Muslim, that doesn't mean that I agree with everything that every Muslim has done, right? So it's making sure that we understand this definition, and that, considering ourselves to be American is not somehow negating us from another type of an identity. So the question is, how do we solve this problem? How do we foster this feeling of belonging among children? There's a couple of key things that we know. The first is related to role models. So role models make a difference. Now, there's two different types of role models that we think about. One is in-group, and the second is out-group role models. In-group role models would be an example of like a Muslim, right? Somebody who's Muslim that is in your group that a child can look to, and that role model somehow showcases or mirrors what does this identity look like. So for example, when I was 13 years old, I had an older brother, Muhammad, who I looked at, and I saw the way that he embodied himself, and that had a effect on me because it helped me understand, well, this is what it looks like to be a Muslim. The second is what's called an out-group role model. This is someone who might not be a Muslim. Oftentimes we term this as an ally, right? Someone who's non-Muslim but affirms this Muslim identity. Now, when I was in the 10th grade, I had a teacher named Miss Serrano. Now, Miss Serrano made an important impact on me because she was not Muslim, but she took a vested interest in me and affirmed my identity as a Muslim. How did she do that? Well, for example, when it was time for Ramadan and we would be fasting, she would say, hey, you know what, Amin? Instead of going to the lunchroom with your peers, if you want to, you can stay in my classroom and you can continue reading, or you can go on my computer and use it. This was back before laptops, okay? I'm not that old, but I was not at a time when we had laptops in school. Another example of what she did is, she took a vested interest in our family, right, as Muslims. And so in 10th grade, as a part of the Common Core curriculum in the United States, every world history teacher has to do a lesson on Islam. And so before she did her lesson on Islam, she actually consulted with me and my dad and asked about our experience as Muslims and wanted to gain empathy for it, such that when she delivered her lesson plan, it would ensure that it is something that helps me in school and helps me fit in and helps me feel kind of accepted and welcome for who I am. And so one of the things that Dr. Rania talked about in her portion was that the events after Christchurch have been interesting when compared to the events after 9/11. Because I believe one of the stark differences is currently the outpouring of support that many Muslim communities and families have had after this event in the form of, for example, churches or synagogues or neighbors or police officers visiting communities or visiting homes to say, we're here with you, we're here to support you, so on and so forth. Much of this has been through the work of interfaith things and bridge building. But these are allies, and these types of out-group non-Muslim allies actually play an important role in affirming our identity as Muslims, in helping facilitate this feeling of belonging. And again, as I say that, it's not to discount the role of in-group or Muslim role models. Of course, the Muslim role models are very important, but this out-group area of allies is also something to invest into. The second thing that we think about is what's called a community of practice. So this, for example, is a picture of a masjid. Oftentimes we think of a masjid as a community of practice, but a masjid is not the only community of practice. A community of practice for a child or an individual is basically the environment within which a child grows up in. So for example, we observe in the data that children who go to schools that have more diversity tend to have more confidence in their identity than children who go to schools that don't have as much diversity. And that makes sense, right? If a child is in a school where there are a host of African American and Asian and Latino and all sorts of different types of people, that would be a different experience because of that community of practice, that social setting, than an environment where it was monolithic, where everyone, for example, was one ethnicity. And so as parents, we have the ability to, in some ways, craft this community of practice. We're able to craft it not only by that decision around schooling, but also that decision around, well, who do we invite over on Friday and Saturday nights? What is the environment within which my child is growing up in through some of the extracurricular activities that they're enrolled in? Also the, for example, weekend Islamic enrichment programs or evening Islamic enrichment programs. So these are some of the decisions that parents are able to make with respect to community of practice. Now, the third thing that I'm going to share is from the data as well. Before I do that, I'm going to turn on my lights. I have a timer on my lights, eco-friendly. Just let me turn them on. 1 second. Okay, the third piece has to do with parents. In our data, we found with statistical significance that children whose mother wears hijab demonstrated more confidence in their Muslim identity than those whose mother does not wear hijab. Now, This observation is not saying that if mothers wear hijab, that's going to solve our problem. That's not what this is saying. What this is demonstrating is that a parent's decision that has literally nothing to do with the child is empirically related to a child's beliefs and attitudes. Okay, so that is a mother's decision to wear hijab that literally has nothing to do with the child actually impacts the way that child believes or feels about himself or herself. Now, when we're doing our analysis, hijab is a very easy question for us to ask and document and look at. But think about the thousands of decisions that a parent makes every single day, right? And these are things that we can't honestly quantify or try to document through this type of research, right? The thousands of decisions that a parent makes every single day and how that may impact a child's beliefs or attitudes. So I'll give you one example, and this is again from my personal life using inspiration from my dad. So I mentioned that I'm Pakistani and I actually have an older brother and an older sister. So what that means is that when we would go on vacation, we would never fly, we would always drive because that's cheaper. And again, I'm Pakistani, okay? But when we would drive and it would be time to stop to perform salah, we'd go to a rest area. Now my father, and inshallah blesses him, and this is not in any way to degrade my dad, it's just to provide a case. When we would go to the rest stop and be time to perform salah, my dad would look to the left, he'd look to the right, make sure nobody was watching, and in that time when it felt like no one was watching, he'd say, okay, now let's perform salah. Now to this day, when I'm at the airport and it's time to perform salah and I put out my prayer mat and I begin to pray, this thought always comes into my mind of this experience of me as a child. Right? A very small example of something that he modeled to me, but that impact on what it meant for me and my identity. So as a parent, what are some things that we can think about? How involved, for example, are we in our child's school? Are we involved in the PTO? Or when there are opportunities to, for example, volunteer on a field trip, do I actually volunteer? How involved are we in our civic community, for example, with our city or our state? These are all types of way that we can actually demonstrate to our children that we ourselves actually have this agency or this responsibility for our community that we live, and therefore that belonging. Now, I do want to share that this. So I'm gonna try to go a little bit quick. I'm actually going to end my comments there, and we will go to Q&A. Before I do, I wanted to, I had one more point related to parenting, but inshallah, if it comes up, I will bring it up. But for the interest of time, we'll go to the chat to see if there are any questions, inshallah. And I'm just going to go through the chat box to see if there were any questions from prior. So Sister Rania, another Sister Rania on the chat box said, when you had mentioned that, part one is to start with ourselves, that's very similar to when you're on a flight and they say put your oxygen masks on first, then help your children.
Precisely.
So if there are any questions, we will go through them. But as of now, there are no questions. So we'll just wait another 2 or 3 minutes to see if there's any questions and go from there.
Brother Amin, I think if it's helpful to add here a point.
Please.
There's, when you were talking, it also made me think about this concept of what we expose our kids to, what they see in us, and what we model. And it also reminded me how, for so many, this particular incident with Christchurch has been so difficult because there was a video that went viral. and it showed, and was the intention specifically of the perpetrator to do this. I mean, he specifically put on, subhanallah, to just think about how, it looked, and was intended to look like it was a video game, essentially. So, he had his headgear on that had the camera. He literally had music playing as though it was, a video game, and mowed down people. The unfortunate thing is, and I heard that Facebook and these folks took down like maybe over 1 million attempts or posts that actually putting on the video. Nevertheless, it's still gone viral, and news has reached us of all kinds of interesting things. Certainly, youth and children have been exposed to this anyway, if they have, again, phones and abilities to see things unmonitored. But I've also had news reach me of like parents who've literally showed their children the video and say, see what's happened to us. And I really want to comment on this point and comment on the point of overexposure of violence. While I can understand the sentiment, I want to tell you how incredibly damaging it is. The person who did this clearly was deranged and damaged, and clearly somebody who wanted this. And first of all, showing that video over and over is what they wanted, and so therefore he wins, which is exactly the opposite of what we want to do. But at the same time, there's so much research on what children are exposed to, and this concept of vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma essentially means that you yourself weren't at the trauma itself, but news of it or images of it kept coming over and over and over until you became as traumatized as the person who was actually there in real time. And that video and the news clippings and the pictures and the over and over and over means that we can develop PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, even though we ourselves weren't, or our children weren't necessarily there. So we really want to take that into account. Please stop forwarding and sharing that video. And if you see it, insist that it gets taken down and not shared any further. And that you yourselves don't watch it. I mean, people have been asking, really, there's a video, where is it? And it's like, no, do not watch that, because you need to be as healthy as you can. Talk about the airplane mask idea, that you need to put that oxygen mask on first before you can help the next person next to you, even if it's a child. Same thing, if you are not healthy enough after seeing that, you won't really be able to take care of that child. So, the last piece I want to say here is about people ask what ages, and we say, or the research literature shows us that by anything violent that is shown to a child 8 and younger has long-term damaging effects on them, which is why there's so many proponents of never showing anything violent, any violent games, video games, etc., to children under 8. I know that even above age 8, it can absolutely continue to have a very damaging effect. So I just wanted to share that tidbit as well.
I appreciate that. So, there's a question here from a sister who said that she has a child in the 3rd grade, and in fact, they're doing a program at their masjid for their 3rd graders, in which they're asking the 3rd graders to write letters to the families that have been affected by the events. And the goal of this is to teach empathy. However, her concern is, how do we talk to a 3rd grader about this in a way that is age appropriate? Now, again, 3rd grade, I believe, is 9 years old, 9 or 10 years old. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Rania, that would be trying to share still the least amount as possible?
Correct. It's and I really, again, I understand where this is coming from. And what I would advise your group is to really check in, first of all, and to see whether the children even know what's happening or not. Because if they're still at that cusp before we hit like the 10, 11, 12, where they very well may have started to hear, but if they haven't, it's not useful actually to expose. There's plenty of other ways to actually teach empathy. If they have been generally exposed, as in to say, the Muslim community of New Zealand has been attacked, something like that, but there aren't a lot of graphic details. And this is very similar to, the fact that many Muslim children, even very young ones, have a very clear idea that there is, several wars in Muslim countries overseas. And so, let's write a letter writing campaign or letters to, Syrian refugees or something like that. They realize and understand, but it's, again, very abstract. So it's hard to understand, where is Syria? Where's New Zealand? Where are these places? And what exactly is happening for them? But it could be very general. So no horrific details, no specific details, but rather just, there are some people that have had it really, that have been, attacked, and it's been very hard for them. And let's write them dua, let's write them words of encouragement, let's tell them how much they're in our prayers would be reasonable to do.
A sister named Mona asked a question. She said, I have a 17-year-old daughter who was crying heavily. I was trying to stay calm and model, as you said, but later she was angry about why I wasn't crying. Should we block our emotions or show them?
Wonderful question, Sister Mona. When a 17-year-old is crying heavily, there are so many different things that are happening in that age group. Certainly the fact that they are teens and they're, you mentioned, Brother Amin, about brain development and how we now know that emotionally and intellectually, the brain isn't fully developed until the age of 24, which means your 17-year-old doesn't exactly have all the coping skills and mechanisms that we as adults, meaning 24 and up, have in place. So it could be quite dramatic, even the kind of response, and it's not very well controlled. And then it can turn and shift from one thing to another. Also, there are stages of grief, and certainly, this shock can happen, of course, but also this outpouring of emotion, as well as anger. So these are all normal reactions she's having. And if she's wondering, why aren't you having them? It would be really important to share with her why, since she asked. So you may say something to the effect, and you'll have to find your own words in this, of, I feel terrible and awful that all of this happened too. But I have not, and I feel very angry too. But what I've done is actually decided to make dua, or I've decided to talk to my local, news channel, or I've decided to, whatever it is that you've channeled your own emotions to show that A, you have them, and B, that you've actually done something with them, and that people are different and they show their emotions differently. So again, the thing I said earlier about controlled anger or controlled frustration is actually very healthy for the children to see. But it doesn't have to be exactly the same mirroring, because remember, parents who are anxious end up raising children who are anxious too. So as much as you can kind of keep that all in place and show what to do with those tears and what to do with that anger, would actually be much more useful.
The two things that I would add and I think about with respect to that question is, number one, this idea of framing. So Dr. Rania did mention this in her dialogue, but I just want to reiterate. It's very important that for an individual who hears about this, who may not have all the information, to understand that this was not the work of a lot of people. It was the work of one person who was, one person who, you could use a word like deranged, or one person who was, feeling this way. And specifically, the converse of that is to remind ourselves that the overwhelming majority of our neighbors and our community denounce this and hate this. And this can be exhibited by the outpouring of support that the community received on a macro level, from people tweeting out sympathy, but hopefully on a micro level as well, where a family can say, did you see how, everyone came together and cared about us and things like that. So it's important to again frame it, to understand that this was the actions of one individual but not that of a entire kind of community or peoples. And then the second thing that we think about is, triggering is real, in that, when an event like this can happen, it can trigger a great deal of emotions, and channeling that in a productive and valuable way is important, like the way Dr. Rania mentioned. Based on our research, the two things that we worry about is in an event where emotions are triggered in a very kind of exciting and big way. These things about assimilation and resistance, we protect ourselves from that by kind of helping channel them in a positive way, like, for example, through dua, or, for example, through, taking action politically, or writing a letter to, your state representative, or, visiting the local police station and, talking about the security measures at the masjid, however that might be, but finding a positive outlet for it. Somebody said, I oversee a program at the mosque, and 7 to 12-year-olds ask about the incident since they learned about it from school. What specifically should their teachers tell them? So this is a program at the mosque. From what I gather, Dr. Rania, and correct me if I'm wrong, again, for that age group, it's telling them the least amount of information possible. So again, there was an event that happened in, far away in New Zealand where one man, hurt a lot of people, and alhamdulillah, now we are safe, or the police are working to make it safe.
That's exactly right, as much as possible. And then from there, after that initial kind of comment, is to really see what they come back and respond with. And again, you have that's 7 to 12 is actually a fairly big age group, so there are many different age grades there. So you want to kind of see what's happening with them. And let me give you an example. Maybe it'll help make it a little more clear. On Friday night, I was doing a program at the masjid, also speaking about parents and what to do and how to help and how to speak and so on and so forth. And literally right before I sat down for the talk, and I have, of my children, there were 2 who were in this age group, the 7 to 12 age group. And the one on the younger end of the spectrum just was in his bubble, completely didn't ask anything, didn't mention anything, it went to the masjid, came back, didn't really pick up on anything at all. And it was better to just keep it that way. The older one, literally right before I started, came up and said, and I should preface this, that the masjid also decided to pray a janazah prayer. So her first question was, who are we praying janazah prayer for? Who are we praying the funeral prayer for? And I said, some people died. When she prayed, she, very curious child, asked the people next to her, who are we praying this janazah for? And so somebody said to her, there was a shooting and 50 people and blood and all kinds of things were said to her. And so she runs up to me literally before I sit down to give the lecture, and she says, Mama, there were people, masjid, attack, people. And she was just, overwhelmed by what she just heard. And so I just said to her, so I said, the inquiry, right? What did you hear? And so she said, and then who did you hear from? Just so I can get a sense of where things are happening. So clearly it was somebody who said it to her, and I understood the main things that she had heard. And I said to her, how do you feel? This is awful. How do you feel? And she said, it's so bad. And I said, it is. It really is bad. What's going to happen? And I said, well, they're working on it. They're working on making it safe. We are working on making the masjid safe. This is a very difficult thing, but we are making dua for them. And inshallah, everyone will be doing better. And so at that point, she said, okay, I have to go to halaqah now. And she just sort of ran off. And I was like, okay. And that was sufficient for that moment in time. Now, what I want to say is kind of like seeing where they're at and what they come back with is really important. because and you may have to actually separate out the different children in the program that you're doing. So you may kind of feel out the ones that are more affected by this and have much more details, maybe even saw the video, from the children who actually are much more were sheltered in this response, in this particular incident, and didn't quite know it much. And you may need two teachers, two leaders to actually like pull apart the group and go into more depth with the group that's really struggling and having a harder time than the group that hasn't. And I really recommend that, so it's not overwhelming for those who don't even know what's happening much, and at the same time underwhelming for those who really need more time to process.
Alhamdulillah. I think we're going to end with that. Before we end, I want to share three quick things. The first one is appreciation for Dr. Rania. Dr. Rania, thank you so much for being a part of this today. Inshallah, your expertise and contributions today will help a lot of parents, especially as they are navigating through this challenge. Number two, I want to share that the Khalil Center is a sponsor of this event, and their organization is one that in the fabric of the Muslim community in America and Canada is an important one in championing a very important piece around mental and spiritual health. Please do take a look at their work. And one of the services that they offer is programs that are community-based, in which speakers can actually come out to programs for sessions on marriage or mental health or parenting. That's a really great way that communities from across the country can benefit from their work, and you can discover it at khalilcenter.com. Finally, Dr. Rania, mashallah, has an extraordinary amount of expertise in this area, in this kind of integration of psychology and Islam. And one of the reasons why is because of the specific organization within Stanford that she's a part of. Her organization basically does research, meaning they create primary research on Muslim mental health. And their organization exists from a number of factors, but one factor is through support. When we finish the live session, what I'll be doing is sending out an email with a recap of some of the things that we discussed along with the webinar, but I'll also be including a link to that. Dr. Rania, can you tell me what the name of the organization is again? It's escaping me.
Sure, it's the Stanford Muslim Mental Health Lab and Program.
Yeah, the Stanford Muslim Mental Health Lab and Program. So we'll be including that information if individuals want to, support that in any way. It would allow us to benefit from the work that Dr. Rania is doing. With that, thank you so much for joining. Dr. Rania, I ask, do you have a prayer that you can think of that would be valuable for us to end on?
Sure, happy to do a small dua at the very end here. Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik ala Sayyidina Muhammad. We ask Ya Rabbil Alameen to shower your mercy down upon us, and Ya Rabbi to accept from us, Ya Rabbi to make it easy for us in our communities. Ya Rabbi, we ask you and we pray for all of those who are fallen, for all the victims, for their loved ones, for their families, for their community. Ya Rabbi to heal, Ya Rabbi to help them process, Ya Rabbi to help them through this tribulation get closer to you and not further from you. Ya Rabbi, even though we may not understand fully everything that happened here and why, that Ya Rabbi, you continue to help us understand that you are boss, that you are in charge. Ya Rabbi, increase our faith, deepen it, Ya Rabbil Alameen, keep our feet steadfast on the straight track, us and our children until the very last day, our progeny ila yawm ad-din. We ask Ya Rabbil Alameen to keep us steadfast and to heal us, Ya Rabbi to strengthen our identity as Muslims and our children, Ya Rabbi to increase us and to give us barakah, Ya Rabbi to protect us and to protect our communities, Ya Rabbil Alameen to uplift us and make us from those who are beloved to you. Ya Rabbi, help us grow that love of you and the love of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in our hearts and in our children's hearts. Allahumma ameen. وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.